being here. I see peers and faculty, but also families and friends. And I'm very happy you're here as long as the fire marshal doesn't kick us out because of overcrowding or something. But we're here to not only listen to the presentations of these magnificent honor students, but also help to celebrate. They've been spending very long months, a lot of time, a lot of effort, emotional energy on completing this research. And between them and their faculty advisors, who we also want to thank a lot, they've done a wonderful job. So we'll have 4 honor students, roughly 30-minute segments, roughly 18 to 20-minute presentations, followed by Q&A, and then transitioning to the next presenter. Our first presenter is Lucy Svoboda, close enough, who's going to talk about unfulfilled promises, evaluating education's outcomes in the K-12 EdTech sector, and her advisors are Professor Bruce Sievers and Professor Rob Risch.
Great, so I'm Lucy Svoboda, and today I'll be talking about the rise of EdTech in K-12 schools, because I'll be using both of those terms a lot. EdTech stands for education technology, K-12 stands for kindergarten through 12th grade, and specifically I'll be talking about the need to evaluate the effect of technology on educational outcomes. Before I start, I want to say a few quick thank yous. First of all, to my advisors, Dr. Bruce Sievers and Professor Rob Risch, who I think is on his way, and to the Public Policy Department, both faculty and students. Thank you all so much for with your guidance and support throughout this process, and just everybody. It's a full house today, but specifically my mom. She's here, although in Chicago. She didn't want me to give her a shout out, but thank you for coming. Hopefully I can. I brought the weather. But yeah, it's a nice day. Great. So before I delve into, I need to click on both. Before delving into the details of the EdTech movement, I want to start by looking at this from a historical perspective. So as you can see, despite the various reforms in K-12 education since the mid-20th century and the rise in per-pupil expenditures, there's actually been very little movement with respect to student achievement. So using the National Assessment for Education Progress, which is the NAEP test, we see that there's been virtually no movement in math scores since the early 1970s. And similarly, looking at reading scores, they've remained relatively stagnant. So this is pretty saddening and frustrating for the education community. But as a result, there have also been continued efforts to try to find ways to innovate and reform the low-performing U.S. K-12 education system. And the most recent reform effort is this focus on innovation and technology in K-12 schools. And so what this has meant is there's been an incredibly large influx of devices in K-12 schools. So those are iPads, Chromebooks, tablets, and then alongside of those devices are a whole suite of apps and other software technologies that both school systems and teachers are using to enhance their everyday practices. So I want to begin by talking about 2 Stanford graduates who are both part of this growing cohort of EdTech reformers. So this is Aurelie Sieda, Professor Boardman's PMA advisee, and she currently in her 6th year of teaching in the Chicago public school system. She taught 3rd and 4th grade, is now the head of EdTech at her school, and is considering leaving full-time to work at an EdTech company. This is Sarah Heaps, also Stanford class of 2010. She spent the past 5 years teaching at the East Palo Alto Phoenix Academy, and then left last year to become the head of content and EdTech company in San Francisco. So both Aurelie and Sarah realized that there was a huge advantage to education technology, both in their own classrooms, so much so that they want to leave their everyday teaching to go work for on the product side of education technology. And as Sarah said, EdTech is a promising space where innovation is incentivized and problem solving can take place without restrictive bureaucracy or severe resource restrictions. The EdTech sector is not just ambitious Stanford graduates, however, there's also an overwhelming amount of private interest in entrepreneurial activity in the space. In fact, since 2010, there's been $2.3 billion of private capital investment in for-profit startups. And just to show the magnitude of this growth, in the first quarter of 2010, there were $22 million invested in EdTech, and that has risen to $350 million in the first quarter of 2015. A quick note, it's not just private capital investment in for-profit companies, there are also philanthropic sources and public dollars by way of national grants going into for-profit and non-profit EdTech companies, which I'll get into in a little bit. So while this growth is certainly exciting, it is also a bit concerning, especially against this backdrop of several failed education reform efforts, many of which gained the same level of support with the same speed as EdTech has. So this concern is the compelling interest behind my first research question. What impact do EdTech companies intend to have in K-12 education, and how are they defining and demonstrating their current progress? My second research question is influenced largely by this large involvement of for-profit and private sector activity in the space. This is pretty distinct from previous reform efforts. And essentially this, the tension between profit maximization and the pursuit of social goods has really raised some concerns. And so the second question is, how do for-profit versus nonprofit incentives affect EdTech companies' ability to deliver educational impact? So now that I've established the premise of my thesis, I will go over my research methodology, discuss my findings and analysis, and then conclude with some next steps to address some of the concerns in the K-12 EdTech space. Great, so these are the 10 companies that I surveyed. I broke them up into for-profit, startups, nonprofits, and corporations, which is largely reflective of the EdTech space. Oh, and then the one thing that's held constant is these are all software companies. So as I mentioned, there's both devices and hardware, but all of these are software products. So in order to tackle the first question, which is largely about how companies are defining and demonstrating their current progress, I developed an impact evaluation framework. Before getting into the impact evaluation framework, I want to take a minute to talk about impact. Impact has become a very popular buzzword in the social good space, and as a result, there are several different interpretations of what impact means. So one end of it is very hard bottom line metrics, social return on investment, benefit cost ratios. And this type of impact evaluation is very popular in an industry such as environmental and energy technologies, because the climate space has really rallied around one metric, which is reducing carbon emissions, which means that all the companies in that space, literally all the countries in the world, can rally around one specific, very measurable outcome. In education, it's a lot more complicated. So there's a lot of debate around whether test scores or graduation rates, which are relatively measurable, can actually capture student achievement. And this does not even include the multitude of other desired outcomes of elementary and secondary education. And these include critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, student confidence, and civic commitment. So as a result of this, there's not one metric that I can use to really evaluate these 10 companies within my analysis. But what I can do is assess the extent to which each company is achieving their stated educational mission in this space. So the logic model is a pretty popular social impact evaluation tool, which links a company's inputs to its activities, to its outputs, to its outcomes, to its impact. Now it's a little jargony, so just to walk you through this, I'm going to use the example of one of the companies in my analysis, a company called NBA Math Hoops. It's a nonprofit, which means its inputs are largely philanthropic resources, and they're using that funding to fuel their product, which is under their activities, which is a board game and an app that allows students to learn math through simulating NBA and WNBA games. Their outputs is largely the volume of the work, so the number of students, teachers, and schools using the product. And then NBA Math Hoops has two distinct outcomes. The first is improved math fluency in faculty with math, and the second is improved attitudes towards math. So their long-term impact, which is usually embodied in a company's mission statement, is one, to improve math performance across the nation, and the second, to develop in students a lifelong love and appreciation for mathematics. So my impact evaluation framework is centered largely around this idea of a logic model. As you see, let's see if I can use a laser. Okay, so stage one is whether or not the company has a stated mission statement, focus on education. The second is whether they've been able to translate that mission statement into defined and measurable goals. Third stage is the extent to which they're comprehensively and thoroughly measuring those goals, so ranging from anecdotes to randomized control trials and pre-post surveys. The fourth stage is the extent to which a company is prioritizing their educational goals in comparison to other operational and business goals. So for the second question, I really pressed companies a lot about why they chose their specific organizational form and tried to tease out what are the specific advantages and disadvantages within operating in either the private or the nonprofit sector. And what I found was that there was a large emphasis on funding, about who they were funded by, which I'll explain in my analysis can be largely predictive of how well a company was able to define and demonstrate their intermediate goals. So I want to walk you through, the funding space is quite complex and is getting even more complex, so I want to walk you through it really quickly. So as you can see, there are 3 different types of funders in the space. The first is traditional venture capitalists. These are the same people that would invest in any other startup in the Valley. And then there's social impact investors, which are actually structured the exact same as a traditional venture capital fund, but they, like a lot of these education companies, have a big lofty mission about transforming K-12 education through technology, and they allegedly are like looking for a double bottom line, so both financial return and some type of social return. Then lastly, philanthropic foundations obviously provide grants to nonprofits. But get this, philanthropic foundations are also now providing investments to for-profits through 2 main vehicles, which is program-related investments and mission-related investments. And so then as a result, the funders are looking for a return from these EdTech companies. The traditional venture capitalists and social impact investors look largely for a financial return, and foundations are focused a little bit more closely on efficacy and mission fulfillment. I just want to say one more quick word about for-profit investor priorities. So this is a diagram that came out in a recent EdSurge article about EdTech funders. And so you can see this, like, their big takeaway was EdTech funders are less interested in time to profitability, which essentially means that they have a longer time horizon, that they're willing to wait for companies to return their financial investment. But if you can look at the bars, these are all the exact same metrics that any other venture capitalist would use for any other startup. So revenue growth, user retention or renewal rate, and there's nothing here about any type of educational or social impact outcome. So given this framework, how did companies actually perform? So with respect to the first question about how they're defining and demonstrating their current progress, I find it's a bit overwhelming. I'll be going through each one one at a time, but find pretty large variation. So after stage 1. So stage 1 is whether or not the company had an educational mission statement. And almost every company, with the exception of Google Apps for Education, did indeed have an educational mission statement. But then when you move into stages 2, 3, and 4, which is the extent to which they can translate that mission into defined goals, comprehensively measure those goals, and prioritize those educational goals, there's pretty extensive variation. So looking first at mission statements, the X means they had an educational mission statement. So what I found was that I think initially there was some skepticism about whether or not these companies were just in this for a profit opportunity, and I think the fact that there is at least some educational mission anchoring them to their everyday work implies that they are in fact, it signals that they are in fact seeking to advance some aspect of education. It also opens them up though to the scrutiny about whether or not they're fulfilling that mission, which is important. Also, because they're interesting to look at, these missions are really vague. So just to read a few of them, help students succeed in school and also succeed in life. That's eSport. MBA Math Hoops, make math fun in a very simple way. Nucella's, unlock the written word for everyone. Motion Math, inspiring kids' delight of challenge. And Khan Academy, provide a free, world-class education for anyone, anywhere. So that brings us to stage 2, which is really the importance of translating these missions into defined intermediate outcomes, such as reading improvement or increased time efficiency for teachers. Moving to stage 3, though, I found that even if a company had that defined outcome, it didn't mean that they actually had an effective way to evaluate it. So if my outcome was improved student reading scores, I could be relying on anecdotes to say that I have improved reading scores. So I essentially used a grading scale to assess the extent to which companies were actually thoroughly measuring their results. So A's were given to companies that had rigorous and consistent evaluation, which meant that their annual evaluation of their other goals included evaluation of social goals. And usually these strategies included randomized control trials, pre and post surveys, and I can talk more about measurement strategies afterwards if people have questions. B went to companies that had performed some type of efficacy trial or pre-post survey, but it wasn't a consistent part of their company evaluation. C's, this one's interesting, companies who, so let's say I said that using drawing activities increases student creativity, drawing assessment. They weren't actually, so when you ask them how do you measure that outcome, they were relying on research that had been done 5-10 years before, that maybe showed that drawing activity improved student creativity, but there was actually no assessment of the actual product itself. And then D's were to my two corporation friends who were like measuring social outcomes. Like, so there was no measurement, and IBM relied a little bit on anecdotes. And they had pretty extensive user research at the beginning of their product development, but there was no clear commitment to measuring social outcomes. So then the fourth, which is really interesting, is prioritization. So I asked each company, what is the most important metric that guides your decision making? And what I found was that there were 4 of the 10 prioritized educational goals, and 6 of the 10 prioritized usage. But they weren't just prioritizing usage and saying, yeah, we don't care about educational outcomes. In fact, they were saying that usage, which is like engagement, monthly active users, user retention, was a proxy for educational success. So they were saying, well, teachers wouldn't use it if they didn't like it, if it wasn't helping their classrooms, or schools wouldn't be paying for it if teachers didn't like it. So this has 2 really big issues. One, that's like a very big leap of faith to be making. Second, it really overshadows a lot of the complexities within the EdTech purchasing and procurement scene. There's a lot of different incentives for schools to be buying different EdTech products, a lot of different incentives for teachers to use it, and teachers also aren't usually considered within the procurement process. So this is pretty unacceptable, and even, so this Monday, Rick Levin came to speak to our class, who, former president of Yale, current CEO of Coursera, which is a higher ed EdTech company. So you're thinking like, oh, this guy's gonna really know about, or really prioritize educational goals, but he said, we're winning in comparison to edX, which is one of their competitors, and it's a nonprofit. And I was like, what do you mean by winning? And he said, oh, we're 3.5 times their size. So this mentality about breadth and just like rapid growth and number of users is really pervasive, even amongst like, you know, one of the most well-respected former presidents of a university. So this is dangerous and really one of the interesting findings within my research. On to the second question. As I mentioned, I really focused on the funding piece. So I reorganized this table based on whether a company has received philanthropic funding or purely private capital funding. And as a reminder, philanthropic funding could mean that they're a nonprofit receiving grants. It could also mean that they're a for-profit that has applied for a specialty program-related or mission-related investment. So what you find, let's get the laser back, okay, is that companies with philanthropic funding really rose to the top when it came to having clear educational mission statements, translating those into defined measurable goals, measuring them with some type of rigor and consistency, and then 4 of the 5 companies with philanthropic funding were the ones that said, our educational goals are the bottom line, those are the most important metrics that guide our decision making. I don't want the takeaway from that to be that private capital is purely evil and doesn't allow for social prioritization of social goals. In fact, for-profit investment is really important, specifically in technology companies, for rapid investment in products and iterations to make really compelling education technology products. It also provides a really clear bottom line so that companies can be results-oriented. And then there's also the aspect of broad reach from for-profit investment. The disadvantages are largely this investor pressure to generate financial returns, which can affect the amount of funding available for research and evaluation of social outcomes, and can also really shift a company away from its social mission. So there's one quote by Dylan Arena, Eric's former boss. On the business side, there are 3 most important metrics: engagement, retention, and monetization. None of them have to do with learning. We can't, as a company, spend a ton of time looking at the learning component. It doesn't move the ball forward in any respect for us. It's a neat thing to do from a research perspective, but it won't help us secure the next round of funding or acquire new partners or anything like that. So it's frustrating. And he was actually a PhD student in education, design, and technology at Stanford, so like, this, I think, really illustrates this investor pressure and lack of incentive to focus on research and evaluation. Philanthropic investment has its own downsides as well. So its advantages are that there's a greater focus on efficacy and mission fulfillment. There can be an encouragement to focus on high-need populations, which for-profit investors are very, very rarely encouraging companies to do. The disadvantages is that foundations have their own priorities. So if I'm a foundation and I'm really focused on rewriting, revamping the history curriculum, and you're a reading comprehension app, I might say, oh, well, you need to fulfill my historical interests, and so I could totally shape the way that you're conducting your business and the goals that you're seeking for that year. So that's called mission creep. There's a lot less autonomy for several nonprofits. There's also a fear of potential lack of sustainability of sources because you need to get new grants each year. A few companies, specifically Khan Academy, has shown that nonprofits are in fact able to to get sustainable funding, but we'll talk about that afterwards. Great, so given these results, what is the best way for the EdTech community to move forward? So what we've seen today is that there is a cause for some concern within the EdTech space. As EdTech gains larger and larger market share across the country and EdTech budgets continue to balloon in K-12 schools, there's a pretty widespread complacency to use revenue generation and user engagement as proxies for educational success, especially from for-profit companies. So because this is a public policy thesis, I'm going to close with how best to drive firms toward accountability to fulfill these promises of educational impact. So the first thing is there's a really large need to establish clarity in the space. And a lot of industry experts have used kind of the fact that this is a nascent industry as a reason like, oh, it's following the span of healthcare. In 5-10 years, we'll see the industry come around, establish these standards. Everyone will be on the same impact evaluation framework. But I think it's really, really dangerous, especially in education, especially given the context of failed reform efforts in the past, to just assume that they will convene and solve it for themselves, especially. So the impact evaluation framework that I provided today, any company can do that pretty easily on their own. The fact is that they're not, and there's really just no pressure from either investors or consumers, who are teachers and school administrators who are concerned with other aspects of K-12 education, to provide these, to provide this pressure and kind of hold companies accountable. So here are 4 aspects of standards. I think the funding standards, as shown through my results, is really an interesting piece, whether or not companies should be required to have some type of blended capital, a mixture of private capital and philanthropic investment. Also, I think there's a need down the line to establish measurement standards, so companies can't just rely on anecdotes, procurement standards, and then accountability and reporting standards for companies to report back to both their investors and consumers. Lastly, it's really imperative for the stakeholders throughout the EdTech sector to commit to a shared research agenda now, instead of waiting down the line until perhaps they realize that technology might be having some unintended consequences. And so here are 4 research questions, I know I'm running low on time, I'm out of time, that I think are really, really important for the community to gather around, especially if they really want, especially if entrepreneurs are serious and truly want to fulfill the promises of educational advancement. Thank you. All right, let's get it.
Sorry to arrive a minute or 2 late. I was Lucy's advisor on the thesis, so I know the material pretty well. And what I'm curious to ask is something we talked about really early on in our discussions about this as you were pursuing the topic, which is the curious absence from the analysis of really large corporate players within education already, like Pearson or the companies that develop tests, which it seems to me are very likely to try to purchase the better performing small startup companies and absorb them into their own business strategies, including perhaps the nonprofit entities, which they could just purchase the assets of and then make use of for their for-profit purposes. So if you imagine that as a plausible medium-run, long-run scenario, how do the policy mechanisms, the standards recommendations you develop interact with what we know about these existing large for-profit players?
Yeah, I think so. One of my questions really focus on what are the effects on long-term incentives for both funders and companies in this space, and I think in the flow of funding that I showed between limited partners, funders, and companies, the one aspect that's missing is the fact that companies, especially these for-profit startups which dominate the space, are looking for either an IPO or some type of exit like an acquisition, which is exactly what you just mentioned by a company like Pearson, which every company I spoke to loathed Pearson and was like, they're doing, they don't care about educational impact.
But might be happy to be purchased by them.
Exactly. But a lot of these people, some are like, I'm not in it for the money. A lot of them are former management consultants, entrepreneurs who are they've worked in for-profit and they are looking for this return. So I think it's really dangerous, and it's been a lot of companies stay anchored to their mission in early stage funding, but I think there's definitely could be huge complacency. Most companies right now are in seed funding or Series A. There's been very few like big exits from the education space. But I think as companies grow and realize, oh, we can make a profit off of this, and we've already baked into our mission that we care about education, I think it's a huge issue. As far as how to keep them accountable, I think having some type of cross-sector standards board in place like would be really helpful, because I think the more you're holding companies accountable to defining and demonstrating their outcomes, you can't, and making sure that they're really baking a mission fully into their everyday practices. By the time it comes to an IPO or some type of acquisition, it will be really, really hard for their new parent company to try to shift their focus.
How do you think you had all these different things, graduation rates and test scores, and then you had all these other things around there. How do you come to a framework that sort of rates or standards on these other things that are not test scores and other things?
Yeah,
so we're talking about those.
That's exactly why I wasn't trying to evaluate how well they performed with respect to those types of outcomes. I think it's inherently always going to be kind of subjective about what you think are the most important outcomes for elementary and secondary education. Perhaps like even if the national government, even if like the Department of Education created some through rigorous research established these are the 6 core values of education, I think that's always going to be kind of subject to interpretation. I would love it if there was like a really clear idea of what those outcomes were, but I just don't think that is plausible. But you can, assuming that each of these companies does have a valuable aspirational goal, then you can hope that they're actually providing the infrastructure to achieve their educational goals.
Could I ask a related question?
Mm-hmm.
If it's not shocking, it's at least very disappointing that you showed us that there's been something like a 3.5 times increase in expenditure, in real expenditures per pupil, with virtually no increase in performance on these test-related metrics. And of course, Greg's question may be, well, we may have improved hugely in all these other things that we can't measure very well. My question's a little different. Can you tell me, where has the money gone? Of this increase per student, where is it being spent? Is it equipment? Is it these tech ed sorts of things? Is it teacher salaries? Where is the money going? And why do you think it's not being very effective?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's definitely a large movement that's saying maybe reforms, especially recent research that's showing that achievement gap is so heavily correlated with income gaps, that maybe reform efforts shouldn't be concentrated within a school, but rather like within urban or like families and yes, exactly, communities and parents. But for each of the reforms, there's been the high stakes standardized testing movement was pretty expansive, and there was a ton of money funneled into redeveloping all of the examinations, retraining, and other resources for schools. Salaries, I think that's more localized, and that's not as much of the federal budget, but that's a good question. And I think also since the 1960s, there's probably just more that goes into everyday, there are more materials, there's more content that perhaps students are receiving, but I don't know, it's a good question. I definitely know that in the past 5 years, a ton of money is being spent on devices in the classroom, and that budgets for K-12 schools for technology is just boomed tremendously. But I could look more into that. It's an interesting question.
By the way, I should have said at the beginning, congratulations. I think this is a very impressive piece of work.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a nice look.
So I think that IBM and Google occupy this sort of unique space amongst the other companies that you are talking about because A, they're both part of larger organizations that have entirely separate missions, and also they occupy like a separate space from what Rob was talking about because they don't need to be acquired.
Yeah.
Often they're the ones actually acquiring these other companies. Like I presume that Google for Education uses a plethora of other apps to facilitate their own goals.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they're both doing really poorly, which is shocking given their scope and their recognition in the field. So what do you see as the best potential for them using that scale that they have moving forward? Because I think they kind of have a different role in the field. So I'd be interested to see how you think that differs from everything else.
Yeah, so the corporations, as you see, like I didn't touch on them as much at the end, but they were really interesting, especially because they felt very fine about not really having a clear educational mission. I think the sad reality, well, first is that especially with Google Apps for Education is like the most widely, they have the broadest scope. They reach like 54 million students, and when you ask them about evaluating student outcomes, they're like, that's a good question. Like, and I'm like, oh, that's so scary. You're like one of the most influential players in the field. Why are you not thinking about this? And he was like, oh, I think there's someone on the marketing team who's thought about this. I was like, well, they don't. They're just using this for marketing material. So it's a really good question. I think the sad reality, and they admitted to it, is it's like a CSR. It's, what?
CSR.
Yeah, sorry, a corporate social responsibility aspect. So it's A, partially play money, and B, it's also like, look, we're helping out education. Also, and then another thing that Google alluded to is the fact that it's just growing their other products. So by capturing users in second grade, they're going to have Google users for the rest of their lives. And they admitted this pretty readily, which was really interesting. I thought they would try to mask it a little bit more. So I think something like a player like Google is interesting because I wonder if all of these companies say they're trying to have impact, but it's confusing whether or not they are. Google is not really caring that much about the educational impact, but there is a great chance that they might be having some type of impact with the scope that they have. As far as how to hold them accountable, it's hard. It's all internal money. I think maybe if the rest of the field starts to shift, and they see, especially if they start seeing consumers asking for these numbers in the procurement process, they're going to have to shift too. But I think they will be the last players to shift.
And I think we've run out of time for questions.
Okay, I can
so
stay after
thank
if you want.